Okay, thank you everybody. Welcome to the Standing Committee on Economic Development and Environment. Today we have the Minister responsible for the Public Utility Board and is presenting a briefing with regard to policy direction issued to the Public Utility Board with the of course, with the Honourable Minister Glen Abernethy. And so, for the record, before we get started, I'm going to ask members to introduce themselves, and maybe I'll start over here.
Good afternoon, Kieran Testart, member for Cam Lake.
Danny McNeely, MLA for Sawtooth Region.
Kevin O'Reilly, Frame Lake.
R.J. Simpson, River North.
And Corey Van Thine, MLA for Yellowknife North. And we also have with us today, at the very far back of the room, we have with us our committee clerk trainee, Jennifer Frankie Smith. And we also have, I believe, Katie Weaver is around, and she is our intern public affairs and communications. And she will be recording this for is it Facebook and YouTube. So, and then I have with me on our left from our research department, Alicia Tumschwitz, and on my right with our committee clerk, Michael Ball. Without further ado, I'll ask the Minister to lead in with opening comments and introduce his staff. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I'd like to thank Standing Committee on Economic Development and Environment for inviting us here today. We're here to brief committee on the rate setting direction that the GNWT recently provided to the Public Utilities Board. Joining me today are John Vandenberg, who is the Assistant Deputy Minister of Programs and Services with the Department of Infrastructure, Robert Sexton, who is the Director of Energy Policy and Planning with the Department of Infrastructure, Alan Cash, the Deputy Secretary to Cabinet, and of course Susan Laramie, who is the Ministerial Special Advisor. Last year it was announced that the NTPC would increase electricity rates. Rate increases are necessary to ensure that the NTPC's revenues cover their expenses of providing power. These increases, averaging 4% this year and 4% next year, will be applied differently to different rate zones to ensure that customers are charged rates that reflect the cost of producing the electricity that they use. Previous GNWT direction allowed up to 3% change per year for rate rebalancing. Without government action, some residents may have been faced with 3% increase on top of the 4% that was approved and announced last year. This needs to be avoided. A 7% increase would be difficult for many ratepayers throughout the Northwest Territories. Understanding this, the GNWT provided policy direction to the PUB limiting rate rebalancing increases to 1%. This will limit rate increases to a maximum of 5% per year. Utility costs in a rate zone change often due to such things as maintenance costs, fuel costs. If a utility tried to recover all of the costs all of the time through rate adjustments, rates would fluctuate constantly or continually. This obviously is not desirable. Consumers want stable rates. A generally accepted rate range of 90 to 110% of costs is reasonable for a small jurisdiction. In this way, fluctuations in costs do not require an immediate change to rates. Most other jurisdictions do follow this approach. The government customers currently pay about 125% of the cost of electricity production in order to subsidize rates for other NWT users or customers. The PUB has been given a policy direction to continue this long-standing practice. If the government rates were lowered to cover only 100% of costs, government would pay about $1.5 million less per year, but this revenue would then need to be collected from other customers through increased rates. It's clear that the government should continue to pay more than their share to subsidize rates for other customers, that there should be a range of reasonableness for the percentage of the actual cost customers pay, and that rebalancing, if any, should be done very slowly. I will ask Mr. John Vandenberg, the Assistant Deputy Minister for Department of Infrastructure, to provide you with a brief presentation. And before we do that, just a note, the application is currently in front of the PUB, so we may, depending on the nature of the questions, if there are any questions, be very specific. We may have to go in camera because some of this stuff is currently before the PUB, but we can deal with that if and when we hear what the questions might be. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Minister, and I'll just let committee know that if there are matters that they feel are going to be in-camera matters, then we would actually try to reserve all of that until the end if need be. And we keep what questions or what have you that we can public. You'll be the one that can best determine some of that.
We'd obviously like to do as much of this in camera as possible, but if we do get into the realm of specifics, we may have to go in camera. We'll flag that when and if the time does come.
And that can come through me.
Yep.
Okay. Thank you, Minister. And at this time, I'll turn it over to Mr. Vandenberg.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Chair, we return to our presentation. I'm going to speak briefly here. I'm going to give an overview of some of the principles of the rate design, the nature of the Public Utilities Board, what previous policy direction to the PUB was given, and the latest policy direction. I'll speak of the Phase 1 GRA, the general rate application, and the Phase 2 GRA. We'll talk about specific rates, rate rebalancing, rate stability, and rate shock, and what clarification was given to the Public Utilities Board regarding government rates. So I could turn to slide 3. The government of the Northwest Territories uses established principles when providing direction to the Public Utilities Board on rate design. The principle that rates should cover the cost of service, for instance, is an established principle for utility regulation applied across Canada. And so is the principle that rate changes should be gradual. The principles of comparable access and transparency were established under the Energy Plan in 2007 and 2010 in response to the electricity review. So essentially, the government's paying more for power to subsidize non-government customers is a long-standing practice in the Northwest Territories. The next, moving along, the Public Utilities Board is an arm's-length quasi-judicial agency of the government. It has powers similar to a court. It's a statutory body that was established under the Northwest Territories Public Utilities Act. Decisions of the board are legally binding. It's an offense not to comply. The government, our government, has authority under the Act to issue policy directives to be applied to the board. We're not interfering with the board process or decisions. It's up to the board to interpret our policy direction based upon its authority and upon the evidence given at the GRA hearing. So the Minister appoints board members from the public at pleasure for terms not exceeding 5 years. Now, I'm not going to read all this, but I'll say that though the government provided policy clarification, the Public Utilities Board will ultimately decide on rates based upon what utilities and interveners propose through the GRA process. We did provide direction to the Public Utilities Board. The government provided direction in 2015 to limit rate rebalancing, to defer community-based government rates, to defer combining of community-based government rates, and setting comparable charges between the three utilities and setting net metering guidelines. Moving along to 2017. Policy direction addressed a number of other, added a number of things, how far that the rates can actually deviate from the cost of power before they're rebalanced, how fast rates should be rebalanced to avoid rate shock to the customers, and that governments would indeed continue to pay higher rates so that residents and businesses would have lower rates, and to maintain an $18 fixed customer charge, fixed costs for the power corporation. With regards to the revenue required, Phase 1 GRA, it's used to determine how much revenue from rates a utility needs to cover their operating costs. So the Phase 1 determines that, and the Power Corporation determined, and through the PUB, to determine that 4% increases in 2017 and 2018 and 2018-2019 would cover their costs. Without these increases, NTPC would be operating at a loss, and we certainly need utilities that are solvent and sustainable. With respect to the Phase 2 GRA, the specific rates for different customers are set based on the cost to provide service. 4% overall increases would not be applied equally to all rate zones or customer classes. And some customers would see less than 4%, and some might see more. They may see more, so that rates cover the cost of producing power in each zone. This is called the rate rebalancing. It's required to ensure that each rate zone pays a fair share of the cost of producing power. In general, governments pay more for electricity to keep costs low for non-government customers, and in principle, customers using power in a particular zone should pay rates that cover the actual cost. But there are constant cost changes or regular cost changes for utilities for repairs and upgrades and fuel. These are some of the examples. And so some rate rebalancing is usually necessary. The questions are, how close to 100% should rates be set, and how quickly should they be rebalanced? To make rates cover exactly 100%, the cost of producing power, it's not practical or necessary. So if we were to do so, it would require regular and quite frequent rate adjustments to make sure that the rates cover 100% of the costs exactly. But this runs contrary to the notion that we want stable rates. Having a range of rates, a range of responsibility, as we call it, helps to buffer the need for these constant adjustments. Generally accepted range, this is similar to the 90 to 100% is similar to the Yukon. It is the Yukon's rate, the 90 to 100% rate of reasonableness. This is considered reasonable, and it's part of the policy clarification that we gave to the Public Utilities Board. So government direction, moving along to slide 12, government direction from 2015 allowed up to 3% rate rebalancing. And what could have happened with that is this could have led to some rates increasing by as much as 7% rather than the 4% average that was announced last year. In principle, increases should be implemented slowly to avoid rate shock. The government of the Northwest Territories provided clarification to limit rate rebalancing to non-government customers to 1% above the 4%. Now, in fact, most customers will not need the 1% rate rebalancing, is because they will now fall within the 90 to 100%, 110% ranges that we have set. Excuse me. These customers will only see a 4% increase. So I'll move along here to the next slide. So the Public Utilities Board required clarification on keeping government rates higher than other customers, and that was noted by the Public Utilities Board in a decision last year. Governments now and currently pay about 125% of what electricity costs in order to subsidize rates for the other customers in the Northwest Territories. And this is a long-standing practice. So the government of the Northwest Territories directed the Public Utilities Board to set government rates between 100% and 130%. That's for government rates. And this will ensure that the electricity costs remain low for the other ratepayers. The government of the Northwest Territories also clarified that government rates can be rebalanced by up to 3%. As the rate shock is not a great issue for the government of the Northwest Territories, we can better absorb more abrupt change. Moving along to the next slide, number 14. The government also directed that fixed customer charges would remain at $18 a month for now, in any case, to protect the lower income households and ensure that customers in every zone for every utility paid the same fixed fee. Government rates in the thermal zone will not be made equal in all communities at this time. This will give the government time to adjust community financing to cover changes in electricity costs. So finally, a summary, please, on slide 15. The summary of the direction to the Public Utilities Board. 90 to 110% of revenue to cost ratio by zone. 80 to 110% revenue to cost ratio for non-government customer classes. 100% to 130% revenue to cost ratio for government customers, a limit to a 1% rate rebalancing for non-government customers, and 3% rate rebalancing for government customers. We will defer equalizing community-based government rates, and the monthly fixed customer charges and demand charges will remain unchanged. This is policy direction. It's ultimately up to the Public Utilities Board to interpret this and to determine how to apply it within the scope of its authority as set by legislation. And that is, if there's any questions?
Thank you, Mr. Vandenberg. So now I'll turn it over to committee for comments, questions, concerns. Any comments, questions, or concerns from committee with regard to the presentation or in general? Mr. O'Reilly.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. So the policy direction, was that given to the PUB while it was in the process of determining the rates? It just seems a bit unusual that policy direction could be given in the middle of a legal proceeding. Thanks, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. And Mr. Abernethy?
Thank you. No, we can give, the Executive Council can provide general policy direction to the PUB, but we can't provide direction into an active or current GRA. This general policy direction that's being provided was provided on February 24th before the second round of the GRA was to kick in. So it was pre the round 2 of the GRA.
Thank you. Further, Mr. O'Reilly?
Thanks, Mr. Chair. So can I get a commitment then out of the Minister that There's going to be some prior communications of future policy directions with standing committee before they're sent to the PUB, because that didn't happen this time. Thanks, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Minister Abernethy?
That is my desire. This one was an interesting case. It didn't come before Cabinet until February 21st. Cabinet has the ability to provide, or rather Executive Council has the ability to provide direction. So we got it on the 21st. It was my responsibility to provide that direction to PUB. Before I did that, I wanted a legal opinion that I in fact could do that. I wanted clarity on section 14.1 and 14.2. I got that on the 22nd. I sent a letter to committee giving them a heads up on the 23rd, which was my earliest convenience to do so. And then we provided the direction to the PUB on the 24th. In the future, I obviously would like to provide more heads up to my colleagues. In this particular situation, the timeline was condensed given that we wanted to have something out prior to round 2 of the GRA.
Okay, thank you. Anything further, Mr. O'Reilly?
I've got some other stuff that I'm happy to have other folks go ahead.
Go ahead.
Okay, I'm trying to figure out these rates. There's rate rebalancing, there's rate increases, and I'm trying to find the page in here where there's sort of two rates in one sentence to actually understand what's happening. Can someone try to explain this in simple language for a guy like me? Thanks, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Thank you. Mr. Sexton?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Sorry. Do you have a specific question, Mr. Oh, sorry, Mr. Chair. Is there a specific question that I could start with, or?
Thank you. You found any more detail there, Mr. O'Reilly?
Thanks, Mr. Chair. So, sorry, I can't find the spot on the presentation because we just got it. But in one bullet somewhere in here, there's talks about a rate increase and then rate rebalancing and limiting. Are both of those things limited through this direction, or and what's the relationship between the two? Thanks, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Mr. Sexton?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. That's correct. There's two things going on here. One is government has set a range so that many rates should no longer have to be rebalanced. So, for instance, what a customer gets charged, or what customers get charged, that revenue has to cover the expense of producing that power in that area. And if you were to go towards 100%, then it was possible that most of the different rate payers would have changes in their rates. But with a range of 90 to 110%, it now means that most rates won't have to be rebalanced because they already fall within that range, or should, depending on the outcome of the PUB process. We don't know yet. For those rates that could fall outside of that range, government set a direction that would limit how fast the rates would change to bring them back within that range. Ultimately, how this works out is a matter for the PUB, and we don't know how it will turn out. But that's essentially what happened. Both of these directions are intended to limit how fast and whether or not there has to be rebalancing of rates. Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Further, Mr. O'Reilly? Well, first, Minister Abernethy.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. It's about providing some stability to the customers to ensure that, they're not constantly having rates change. By having a range, as the costs move within that range, we don't have to run out, or rather the Power Corp and the PUB don't have to run out and do an adjustment every time. They can work within that range. And when it goes outside that range, say it were to get past 100 or 90 to 110, that cost would have to be recovered from the ratepayers. What we're saying is we'll collect that slower than faster. So 1% instead of a 3 or 4% to have less significant impact on the end users, the customers, at the end of the day. So it's about trying to mitigate the hit on the customers, but keep them within a range that allows the organization to still pay its bills and produce power.
Thank you. Further, Mr. O'Reilly?
Thanks, Mr. Chair. I've got a couple of others, but I think there are others that would like to ask questions. So
Okay.
if you can put me back on the list, that'd be great. Thanks.
Okay. Thank you. Next, I have Mr. McNeely.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. My question is probably similar to a lot of questions that have been asked to the PUB over the rate adjustment hearings, and I would say number one, we have programs such as the Arctic Energy Alliance energy reduction programs that are questionable to the point where we're saying to, or the average person is saying, why is rates always going up and never maintaining themselves to the point where you're not using as much power as you used to because you have more solar panels in the community, more wood pellet appliances coming on stream in the marketplace and household. So for those reasons, why is it always going up? Could we minimize that to satisfy some of these questions by saying we did a internal company, in this case it would be a power corporation company, operations review, and we have adjusted policies to minimize where our spending is? Has that other alternatives other than hitting the ratepayer with more increases ever been done? Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Mr. Abernethy?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Chair, it may have been appropriate to have some different ministers here. I'm not the minister responsible for the Power Corp. I'm the minister responsible for the PUB, which is the body that reviews applications and determines rates. I think the question that's being asked is more suited or more appropriate for the minister responsible for infrastructure and the minister responsible for the NWT Power Corp. I'm not prepared to answer questions that I think they should be answering. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Anything further, Mr. McNeely?
Okay, my other question is that the minister, you had mentioned mitigating the rates between 4%, and are we going to see any other rate increases within that parameter during that time frame? Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Mr. Abernethy?
Thanks, Mr. Chair. Mr. Chair, the 4% is for GNWT as a customer. We're proposing, or we recommended 1% for non-GNWT customers within the ranges. The ranges are set up in order to help us offset or avoid sort of constant readjustments, constant changes. But you know, all things being known, we obviously don't hope to see any large increases, but things could change in the world. Oil prices could go up. There could be other problems that come up that could have an impact on rates, forcing it outside of our range. But those are unknown. We're trying to plan based on those known things at this point in time.
Thank you. Anything further, Mr. McNeely?
Yeah, I ask these questions. It's sort of interrelated. On one hand, we can say, okay, well, I'm the minister of PUB, which is right. But on the other hand, this same government manages the operations through the DMs having control on the board level for the operation of the producer. So in one hand, it just doesn't make any sense. But I just raise that as notice. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Okay, comment noted. To the comment, Minister Abernethy.
Thank you, and I totally appreciate that, and I get where the member is coming from, and we have staff here who are taking notes, and I will certainly share your concerns and your suggestions with the appropriate ministers. I'm just not in a position, as I am not the minister responsible, to speak on their behalf. But I will absolutely share your comments and your thoughts with them, and I think there's value in possibly having them come back for further discussion. I do know that the Department of Infrastructure is coming out with a couple of documents here shortly, to committee first, and then depending on committee feedback further. There is the What We Heard document that's coming out. I think we're just working on some lettering to get that on the energy strategy, and then there's a draft energy strategy coming back to committee. That one's going to be in confidence until such time as committee's had an opportunity to consider and discuss it with the appropriate cabinet minister. The What We Heard document, I believe, is just going to be released. So there is information coming out that I think is important to this committee.
Okay, thank you. Next I have Mr. Tester.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So these ranges that have been established, does the rate rebalancing caps, do they apply after, just if I can get this straight, Mr. Chair, do they apply after those ranges have been exceeded, or are they built into the range? Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Vandenberg. Mr. Sexton.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. It will be once rates go outside of those limits that the rebalancing would be applied of 1% for non-government or 3% for government.
Sorry, I said 4% earlier, I meant 3.
Thank you. Further, Mr. Testart.
Thank you. And does the PUB establish like a 90% rate when they're looking at this, and then we work to fill it up, or do they just look at the rates and see if they fit into those ranges? Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Sexton.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. The way it works is in a Phase 2 Public Utilities Board GRA is that in a zone or for a particular customer, part of the process is to identify how much it actually costs to produce power for that customer, and then the rates are set based on that cost. So there's a back and forth between the utilities and the interveners on what's a justifiable cost and what the rates should be. And as mentioned earlier, those costs do change over time. So if it is within that range, then there's no need for readjustment. But so I'm not sure if that answers his question, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Anything further, Mr. Testart?
It's somewhat tangential to this, but there is we've seen public direction offered to the Public Utilities Board twice on these issues, which are important and relevant issues, but we also have a mandated commitment to provide direction to them on net metering. And I know that's not the purpose of today's briefing, but I just wanted to know if the minister can give assurances that that is being worked on, and that the committee will be involved in that that process as it rolls out. Thank you.
Thank you. Minister Abernethy.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Chair, obviously net metering is something that is available. We're looking at it. More work needs to be done, and we're going to do that work. Interestingly enough, during the public meetings and the public hearings that were held around the energy strategy, we were hoping that that would come up and that would help us inform how we move forward with net metering, and it was not raised ever during any of these meetings, or very, very, very little, as a matter of fact.
Thank you. Further, Mr. Testart.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. All the more reason that the standing committee that has shown an interest in this policy issue that is perhaps somewhat complex for the average northerner should be involved in that discussion. So I appreciate that the minister may have exhausted opportunities to discuss this amongst the public, but there's certainly an appetite here to do that work. And I know I have constituents who make use of net metering and are unsatisfied with the results. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Comment noted. Next I have Mr. O'Reilly.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. Yeah, I want to echo my colleagues' comments about net metering. I've had people approach me and talk about the inadequacy of the current system after having invested money in solar systems here in Yellowknife. So, in any event. But I do want to ask the minister probably more of a philosophical question. So why did the minister or the cabinet, I guess, feel it's necessary to issue this policy direction? Presumably GNWT's an intervener before the PUB, and couldn't it have made the case before the PUB about rate shock and all of that without having issued binding policy direction? Thanks, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Minister Abernethy.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Chair, the legislation, Section 14.1, 14.2, do allow the Executive Council to provide some policy direction, not on an individual application, but in general to the PUB, which is what we did in this case. The primary reason we did so is recognizing a number of our mandate items which talk about cost of living. Had we not done this, there's a chance that the rate on customers across the Northwest Territories, residents, people in their homes, people, living day to day, could have been impacted far greater. The GNWT's cost would have gone down likely, but the people's cost would have gone up, and in line with our mandate, we felt that this was inappropriate, so we thought it was important to provide some direction in order to put some caps on what the hits could be to our residents across this territory.
Thank you. Further, Mr. O'Reilly.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. Yeah, I get all of that. I guess where I'm going with this is what's the point of having a PUB when the government can issue binding policy direction and yeah, maybe I'll just leave it at that. Thanks, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Minister Abernethy.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Chair, the member's using some interesting language. This isn't binding. This is more of a suggestion or a recommendation. The Public Utilities Board does have the ability to interpret this as they see fit, and they could interpret it differently than we're suggesting. We were suggesting that there is an opportunity here to remain or relieve some of the costs on the GNWT and reduce the increases that would be affected on our residents across the Northwest Territories. So this isn't binding per se. It's a recommendation, it's a policy direction, but the PUB does have significant independence, and they still do.
Thank you. Further, Mr. O'Reilly.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. But presumably if the PUB went outside of the direction, it could be challenged in court and so on. But I guess I'm trying to understand if we're going to if Cabinet is going to continue to provide binding policy direction on, the Minister doesn't like it when I say binding, policy direction on rate applications in the future. What's the point of having a Public Utilities Board? Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Minister Abernethy.
The Public Utilities Board still serves an important role. They do a significant amount of work, and they do still have a significant amount of independence when it comes to the actual rates, when we're looking at determining what the 100% is, what those actual costs are going to be, and they still have an opportunity here from interveners on a wide range of clients to get input into what rates will be. So this is a policy direction in order to keep some of the costs on the GNWT and free up some room so that the residents and customers aren't getting hit quite as hard as the GNWT moving forward.
Thank you. Anything further, Mr. O'Reilly? Further from committee, comments, questions, concerns? Sorry? No. Seeing none? I'm going to turn it over to the Minister if you have any closing comments at this time.
No, just thank you so much for having us to go through the detail. I know it's complicated, but I think it's important to get in front of committee to share this information as well as share with the public. Thank you.
Thank you, Minister, and thank you to you and your colleagues for being here and presenting today. And I'm going to ask the committee if they can hang around here, and this portion of the meeting can be concluded. Thank you.
Thank you.